Video Apology to a Stephanie Cano from Ian Johnson, Part 5b, Crawling in the Dark, December 11, 2024 to March 13, 2025. In this video, I'll go through what happened during the time of my formal exclusion from Centro Biblico El Camino. There were many moving parts in this story, so it is complicated. But the most important thing was a gradual change in what I saw as most important. This involved a shift away from giving importance to learning what I was being accused of doing, and away from wondering if I could still do anything to serve God in spite of it. Instead, I have moved toward making reconciliation the most important thing in my life, even if it takes the rest of my life. I have come to believe this truly reflects Jesus' priorities, which place his body and the people around me in that body far above any service I might do for him. You are not the only sister or brother in Christ who I need to pursue reconciliation with, but you are one of the two most immediate ones, and the one who God has kept in the center of my attention for the last year. I know this video looks very long and boring, but the good news is that nearly all of where it is going is explained in the February 19, 2025 email it starts with. Everything after that simply lays out the communications in which the shift happened, often with little or no explanation beyond the document itself. I don't think I left anything out, but you may not want to go through it all. It is pretty much all summarized in the first document. Yes, in mid-January of last year, Pastor Doyle started trying to schedule a meeting with Pastor Jonathan. It never happened. For Pastor Doyle, learning the details of what I had done was always the most important purpose for this meeting. He had to know whether he needed to take more drastic steps against me at First Southern, but I was moving away from this emphasis by mid-February. First Southern considers the matter officially resolved as of June 2, 2025. We are in no sense reconciled to each other. The fear and anger are so great that I still don't even exist in your world. But as far as the church is concerned, I am back to business as usual. So are you. We are back to church and real world business as usual in two entirely separate bodies of Christ, located in two entirely separate worlds. This slide and the next three are the heart of the problem. I'm strongly questioning whether the broad principle of pastoral authority actually does, or even can, override the three grammatical imperatives in Matthew 5:23 and 24, which seem directly aimed at me in this situation, analyzed below. Therefore, if you are presenting, present subjunctive, your offering at the altar, and there you remember, present subjunctive, that your brother has something against you, leave, aorist imperative, your offering there before the altar, and go, present imperative. First be reconciled, aorist imperative passive, to your brother, and then come, which is a participle, and present, present imperative, your offering. This construction, a third-class conditional sentence, present general condition type, strongly suggests that whenever I am about to offer anything to God, and at that time remember that a brother or sister has something against me, I must stop, leave what I was doing, leave the offering there unoffered, go and be reconciled to my brother or sister, and that until reconciliation occurs, I am not to return and offer my gift. I also can't weasel out of the way to this passage by simply deliberately forgetting Miss Cano, her family, and the offense that lies between us. I am reminded of the offense by the rules Pastor Castillo told Houston Thompson to tell me to keep. which require me to actively hide from all of the members of Miss Cano's family on Sunday mornings, to consciously plan my movements so there is no chance any of them will even see me on the other end of the parking lot from them. So even if deliberately forgetting an item of long-term memory were physiologically possible, it wouldn't be possible in this case, because I'm required to reinforce that memory every Sunday morning. Thus, since I am required to remember that a whole family has something against me, the protasis of the conditional sentence is satisfied, and the apodosis must also apply to me. I should not try to offer anything to God until reconciliation begins. And I am also aware that the longer an attempt at reconciliation is postponed to comply with pastoral authority, the more likely it will become that all of us, me, Miss Cano, and her family, will simply become permanently restricted and tortured by the unresolved offense, as suggested by the next two verses of Matthew 5 and the last four verses of Matthew 18, the conclusion of the unforgiving servant parable. Come to good terms with your accuser quickly while you are on the way with him to court, so that your accuser will not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will not be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you have paid up the last quadrands. Matthew 5:26 and 27. Then summoning him, his master said to him, You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not also have had mercy on your fellow slave in the same way that I had mercy on you? And his master, moved with anger, handed him over to the torturers until he would repay all that was owed him. My heavenly Father will do the same to you if each of you does not forgive his brother from your heart. I accept the torture for myself. I do not accept the torture for you and will keep on fighting for your peace. In this next piece of the email, note carefully what I was saying here and what I was not saying. I was not asking to have access to you physically in person. I was not asking to come back to El Camino. I was not asking for direct contact of any sort. No, for the last month before this email, I had been asking the two pastors to agree to ask you and your family if you would accept contact through a properly trained mediator. The purpose of the mediation would have been to agree on my limitations going forward so that you could feel safe with me still in your world, as I am. That is a physical fact. I'm still here. You could also have asked me to agree to any additional punishment you wanted to see me bear to help you feel that justice had been satisfied. You could also have told the mediator anything you wanted me to recognize and acknowledge about how I had wronged you, and then have asked me to respond through the mediator if you wanted a response. If a counselor might have helped you work through the damage I left in your life, the mediator could have pointed you in the right direction for that. And I also hoped that the mediation might start the process of reconciliation in the very limited sense of mutual forgiveness and acceptance of each other as real people and members of the body of Christ again. That had all been explained in earlier letters and emails to both pastors. I recognize that it would be far preferable to seek reconciliation through a mediator or through some other means proposed by the churches involved, with the approval and involvement of both pastors. But if it becomes obvious that this will never happen, Matthew 5:24 appears to be a clear command directed to me, go and first be reconciled, and I may have to act on my own to perform it. My analysis of Matthew 5:23 and 24 follows my electronic signature. Please pick any holes in it that come to mind while you are reading it. Note that when I wrote this email, I was almost ready to try to obey Matthew 5:23 and 24 on my own, even though the pastor still flatly forbade it. Neither of them picked any holes in my argument either. There were 6 different things happening at the same time, often in the same communications during this period. 1, everyone trying to figure out what exactly I had done. 2, me trying to find out how I was now limited. 3, my misguided attempts to advocate for you in the process. Number 4, my attempts to apply the Matthew passage to myself in the face of the insistence that this scripture cannot be applied to, quote, victims of trauma. You were the victim of trauma. 5, communications about the fund for your use. 6, First Southern trying to figure out what to do with me in their church. The dilemma of all involved at First Southern. I was the only source of information, and I was the accused. When Houston came to give me Pastor Jonathan's orders, I thought he had also said that Jonathan had told him no specifics of what I had done. In this slide and the next, I will ask for verification of that. At this early date, I was still pretty focused on this question. All Houston had been told was that I had said something objectionable, nothing more. An email confirming this. Kafka raised a good question. Are we all perpetually on trial or on probation for an unstated capital offense? Where Kafka's question was trying to lead me in my own situation. Should I find a monastery? Here I'm just beginning to recognize that I'm going to have to simply accept the judgment that I'm horribly evil without ever knowing why with any certainty. Because in this matter, it is only your feelings, your judgment, that matters. Yes, all I say here is true. Yes, but only your judgment matters. So I really did do the worst imaginable thing to you. Houston's questions in this email are the questions that had to be asked so that First Southern could know what to do with me. Jonathan hadn't told him what I had said that I shouldn't have said. But had I already been told this information? Did I already know? Once reconciliation is abandoned as a goal, church discipline is based on objective facts. Objective facts are irrelevant between the two of us. Only feelings matter. That is the most important distinction in the world. Houston's objective information and mine were both very limited. Stating again, my information was as limited as Houston's. More of the same. In the absence of reliable information, First Southern had to assume that I was minimizing my guilt and that the objectionable things in my text messages were indecent and very serious. They also could not rule out the possibility that something more than text was involved. But an assumption like this is not adequate grounds for any long-term decision. So Houston started asking Pastor Jonathan to provide more details. None were ever given. In December 2024, I wasn't thinking clearly enough to realize that most of the texts were still available on my cell phone. That realization didn't hit me till May 2025. When I realized this, I transcribed the messages. All of the messages remaining on my cell phone in May were included in a previous video. Late in December, Houston suggested to me that I should write a formal request to Pastor Jonathan, asking him for the specifics of the charges against me. Everyone involved on the First Southern side needed this information to know what to do with me. So on January 3rd, I sent a very formal letter in Spanish to Pastor Jonathan, both by regular mail and as an attachment to an email, with copies to Houston and Pastor Doyle. This is the original Spanish text in my January 3rd letter and email to Pastor Castillo. This is the English translation sent to Doyle and Houston. In this January 4th email, I'm beginning to move away from focusing on the charges towards repairing the damage. My first response to Houston's diagnosis that you were traumatized was to try to make provision through First Southern for any counseling or treatment you might need. I'll give the details later in this video. If I am responsible for injuring you, I should at a minimum provide the means for the treatment of your injuries. Creating the fund for your use was an attempt at basic biblical restitution in a culture that ordinarily ignores it. It was my duty to do this, and doing it really doesn't say anything good about me. I couldn't just give it directly to you or to your father because all contact was prohibited. My focus in this email is entirely off of determining the charges and on to reparations and dispute resolution. In this email, Pastor Doyle acknowledges receiving the letter and the check that went with it, and says the check will be held in escrow so that if needed it may be used. Unless you have used it, it should still be there. But given Pastor Doyle leaving First Southern 4 months later, I doubt that it is. By this email on January 24th, my focus is now firmly on dispute resolution. Pastor Doyle's focus was still firmly on meeting with Jonathan to get the facts. The church's focus was still on facts, but for me personally, I must simply assume that I have already been found to be guilty of something sufficiently bad to support anything either pastor had done or might do in the future, even though exactly what it was is none of my business. My counselor would have asked a good question here, except that to your pastor, Your stated feelings are an objective fact, the only objective fact that matters. This email states a question that was asked but never answered. But wait a minute. 1 month later, Pastor Jonathan doesn't understand what the problem was. This slide and the next two came in an email exchange a few days after Pastor Jonathan said he didn't understand the problem. They reaffirmed that Houston had never been given any specifics of the charges. Summary of all the information First Southern, that is Pastor Doyle, Houston, and later Pastor Sean, ever had. Number one, I had said something objectionable in a text message to you, according to Pastor Jonathan's text message to Houston. Number two, it was bad enough that your parents were concerned about it. Number three, it was bad enough that Pastor Jonathan excluded me and your parents declared me dead. Number four, you had never complained directly to anyone but your parents about it, as far as we know. Number five, Houston had observed in writing that you were traumatized. Number six, I admitted that my words were not cautious enough, but denied any intent to harm and denied any improper behavior other than words. Number seven, in the end, Pastor Jonathan said he didn't understand what the problem was. From here on, the presentation will be chronological, and many pages will not have any accompanying comments. What is important in all of this is not the details so much as the way my thinking and that of the pastors was changing with time, changing in opposite directions. An early example of unrealistic wishful thinking and rose-colored glasses. These have always been problems. The last part of the previous slide. My plan going into this period, I saw the importance of going to be reconciled in Matthew 5:23 and 24, but also understood it to be prohibited by pastoral authority. So at this point, my focus was on how to exist within any church at all and still stay within its limitations as one who was not and would never be reconciled to you. Point 4, dealing with money, was predictably the one that raised objections. This was the beginning of the idea that I should use the funds Jesus' words wouldn't let me use as immediate offerings to the church to instead provide for reparations to you and your family. It is actually pretty well carefully structured, even in this early version. Response to an objection that had already been made that applying the Matthew passage literally, as prohibiting offerings was wrong because it put God on a timeline. Lots was said about this later. Say what you will about anything else, but don't mess with the money. God desperately needs it right now. What categorically forbidden in this report means is that any thought of reconciliation is forbidden by the broad category of cases to which Houston said our situation belongs. He had diagnosed you with trauma, which I had caused. You are thus a victim of trauma, and the case falls into the broad category of traumatic emotional injuries. Houston stated that modern practice forbids the person who caused a traumatic emotional injury from ever seeking reconciliation with their victim. Therefore, what Matthew 5:24 commands is categorically forbidden in any case of traumatic emotional injury. Obviously, Jesus was limited to first century knowledge of human emotions. We know better now. Accepting that modern psychological practice controls the interpretation of Matthew 5:24 because Jesus' psychological knowledge is now obsolete. I'm just stuck. I'm prohibited from giving offerings, but I'm also prohibited from ever seeking reconciliation. So I will never again be able to give offerings to God. But I can also be cursed for robbing God? A bad situation all around. If I can't give offerings until I'm reconciled, and I'm prohibited from ever seeking reconciliation, I wonder how that affects this verse. This slide restates the pragmatic reading of Matthew 5:24, which makes it a nice wish that will almost never be kept rather than a command. Unfortunately for me, Jesus doesn't endorse it as under this pragmatic reading. It looks more like a command that has severe consequences attached to it. Can I really give God a cash flow problem? Is God really as needy as this suggests? Yes, I'm saved. The problem is a problem with the question. In response, here is Houston's explanation of the 12-step concept of amends, which is for me, not for them. In this situation, amends are not for you and not for your benefit, but only for my benefit. Yes, forgiveness is being free of past resentments and does not by itself reconcile. And it is unilateral. I can't do it for you. You can't do it for me. For the big problem with the argument made on this side, see the long string of slides on this subject that starts below. This particular argument mixes three different concepts: holy things, the sacredness of my pain, and the implications of trauma, which do not necessarily mix. It also implies that reconciliation implies restoring access, exactly as before the hurt, which is often not true. As explained on this slide, 12-step amends and reconciliation are not the same thing. Making an amends which is rejected is all that is required for my internal peace under the 12-step teaching, but it leaves me unable to give acceptable gifts to God under Matthew 5:24 if that is read literally. Reconciliation doesn't mean the relationship has to be just like it was before. Usually it shouldn't be. Impracticality due to the expected effect on offerings really isn't a valid argument. To prioritize keeping our church budgets above doing what Jesus said to do makes us hypocrites, the number one complaint of unbelievers against Christians. More of the same argument. What Shakespeare's Juliet really said was, "What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet." But what's true of roses should also be true of pigs, don't you think? And I sure don't want to be a pig in sheep's clothing. More problems with being an ex-human pig. Does the sacredness of the space in which I keep my pain mean I'm free to hate you for my pain, you pig, and no one, not even God, will ever dare say anything about it? Does the sacredness of your pain really make it a sin for me to ask God to reconcile us because I'm asking him to invade your most holy pain? Kafka again, in its chronological place in the discussion. I must consider my restrictions and remember 3 of the 4 people or groups here named are still involved. Centro Biblico no longer exists, but its members still do. This slide is the question that led ultimately, through the next 11 slides, to the major clarification that the requirements that I must show shame, run, and hide only applied to you and to your family, not to all members of Centro Biblico. But taken together, they also show just how strict those requirements were. Avoiding accidental contact, more than it sounds like at first. Keeping distance and avoiding eye contact. This states the question I may never ask. Not permitted. The overarching question, doesn't shunning by one local church on proper biblical grounds imply shunning by all churches? And doesn't it also imply the possibility of future restoration, like that of the Corinthian man Paul ordered shunned? Here I'm comparing myself negatively to that Corinthian. Four ways in which my restrictions were not like an order of protection issued by a court. Won't avoiding and showing shame before men from El Camino who are not involved in the facts of my situation insult them? Victor as an example. Clarification. You and I both know I didn't do the worst thing imaginable to you. My offense was just words which were not intended to injure. That's what the email says. But only feelings really matter. The parolee's dilemma. December 18th, 9 days after I was placed under the restrictions, Houston clarifies that they applied only to members of your family. Quote, those claiming offense. This is the first time I knew this. How I had previously understood my restrictions. Houston's question about what I knew or had been told about my offense and my response in their proper chronological place in the story. This slide and the next four. Part of which contained a confirmation that if I encounter members of El Camino who are not members of your family, I should engage, acknowledge them normally. Timing and details of the check that established a fund at First Southern for your use. This was my first response to Houston's diagnosis that you were traumatized. I don't know if you were ever informed of this by anyone with official standing, but I doubt it. January 4th, asking if the letter and check had been received. The same question repeated 6 days later, followed by my first request for direct involvement by First Southern in resolving the dispute, citing the procedure Jesus stated in Matthew 18:15 through 19. The problem with that procedure is that it calls for face-to-face meetings. It took me another week of study after this to find Paul's instructions for mediation of a particular dispute in Philippi. Mediation doesn't require face-to-face meetings. Here Pastor Doyle acknowledges receiving the letter and the check and says the check will be held in escrow so that if needed it may be used. Unless you have used it, it should still be there. But given the fact that Pastor Doyle left First Southern 4 months later, I kind of doubt that it is. January 18th, 2025, my first request for mediation. This slide and the next 6 slides explains as clearly as I could what I was and was not asking for. I'm no longer asking to be told the details of my offense. Mediation would only seek agreement on practical questions going forward. No face-to-face meetings. We would each meet with the mediator separately. I was never refuted. Or paid attention to. My reason for asking for mediation and for an attempt at the beginning of a limited reconciliation in the mediation, stated here. I'm not trying to get out of bearing all the blame for the situation. I'm only trying to limit future damage from it. Reconciliation is restoration of harmony, not a return to the status quo. Two churches were being damaged by the unresolved conflict. One of them still is. Now you may see my first sentence and ask, but haven't I actually been forced to accept the usual way of doing things by the two churches' decision to simply ignore my request? No, this video apology continues my rebellion against the usual way of doing things. I still invite reconciliation, finding an intermediary you trust and asking them to contact me. Mediation is still an option, but First Southern won't be involved in it. In this slide and the next 3, I added some mechanical details to my original mediation proposal. The detail which may have prevented this from moving forward was the first one. The first person the mediator should talk to is you, by yourself, and only after that your family. I thought at that point in time that the main purpose of the mediation should be to find out what you want, what will make you feel safe, what will make you feel I have been put under proper limitations, what will make you feel justice has been done. And only then try to reach an agreement that will give you all of this. I put you first, which in retrospect may have created a problem. After that, to start to approach limited reconciliation. Here's the list. what the mediation will not be trying to do. I knew that pastoral authority was going to be required and it was going to be a problem. I also note, though, that if mediation had happened, any of it at all, it would at least have let me know that I shouldn't come back in March. This slide and the next three list the practical questions I wanted to see answered at that time. You would have been free to add your own questions. Only 4 of these even make sense to ask today in any form, numbers 2, 3, 4, and 6, although the context of them has changed greatly in the last year. These two have no relevance today at all. This slide and the next one are excerpts of another attempt to convince the pastors that mediation should be tried. January 24th, 2025 request for a brief meeting with Pastor Doyle about this. Pastor Doyle's response was that he would not meet with me until Pastor Jonathan responded to his request to meet with both of us. That meeting never happened. Pastor Doyle also said that he liked the mediation idea, but it would have to wait until we met with Pastor Jonathan to discuss the charges against me. He was still focused on the charges. This slide and the next 7 slides are February 6, 2025 cover email and excerpts of a letter on the same date to Pastor Jonathan in Spanish, presenting the mediation idea to him. They really contained nothing new, except that they were directed at Pastor Jonathan specifically. The importance of reconciliation on this page. Excerpt from the beginning of the letter. I recognize the interest and importance of your family in the matter. One great advantage of mediation mentioned on this page would have been that it would have taken the time burden entirely off of the 2 busy pastors and placed it on a mediator who was being paid specifically to give her attention to the dispute. my concern with the long-term effects of bitterness. Beginning of the list of issues. End of the list. This slide and the next two are the exchange about the details of my offense being none of my business, due to the need to respect pastoral authority, repeated in chronological context here. Still a good question, if it weren't that only feelings matter. Yes, I wasn't accused of murder, that's true. But it was still heinous enough that the answer must have been yes to that question. Too bad. This is an email transmitting my mediation proposal to Pastor Jonathan and an uncorrected Google English translation of it to Pastor Doyle and to Houston. Yes, I'm more than a little cynical. That's still true. This slide and the next three are a despairing Facebook post I put up on February 23rd, 2025, occasioned by this situation. March 3rd, 2025 text message exchange with Houston about the recent emails to the pastors about mediation and about the Facebook post. I asked Houston not to answer for the pastors. This slide and the next one are a March 6, 2025 note to Centro Biblico's treasurer, delivered in an envelope with an offering. explaining the artifice I had been using to keep giving in spite of Matthew 5:24. I do not want to misrepresent myself. Second piece of that note. March 8th, 2025, text message exchange with Houston about my Spanish speaking ability improving because of the Washburn class. So Pastor Jonathan should no longer need to deliver messages to me one way through Houston. Well, here is the March 13th, 2025 surprise. Pastor Jonathan didn't speak to me, and he didn't speak to Houston. He spoke to Pastor Doyle. I was not asking for what he gave here. I was asking for something that would probably have had a better effect. I don't know. I may be misjudging the situation, but I get the impression Pastor Jonathan didn't want to talk to me. He didn't talk to me after this either. So, like it says here, the two great mistakes that flowed from this email, plus the lack of information and some inexcusable wishful thinking on my part, are the subject of the next video. This is the end of this awfully long one.